This is the Real Coaching Podcast. I'm Joe Filliol, international coach based in the UK and Spain. And in our previous episode and Substack article called Don't Be a January Champion, it is interesting. It became a bit of a meme, kind of relatively widely shared, and comments including hashtags after some athletes performing in January. So all in good fun, but it did make me reflect. I suppose the motivation for sharing all good, I think, coaching content is essentially a note to yourself or clarifying thoughts over time. And certainly when I reflect the biggest mistakes I've made in my career of coaching, have indeed been connected to that theme of doing too much too soon, performing at the wrong times. I think every athlete and coach can reflect on when the timing went wrong, when the athletes performed very well unintendedly, often at the wrong time of the year, or arrived at the final or championships and not able to express themselves. So certainly that's where that comes from. And it's also interesting, even in some very good athletes, also from a learning point of view, it's not always what the top athletes do, but how that applies to everyone else, because there's always exceptions to any sort of rule, like is discussed in this article. And particularly with top athletes, you don't know what performances have been left on the table, and that's going to be another discussion, another podcast. What we can learn from experiences with really top athletes. But I think it goes to the role of coaching, of how do we learn from experiences beyond just the n equals one of an athlete performance or a single athlete, but how do we zoom out, uh, connecting the dots, looking at the bigger picture, looking for patterns and building our database of experiences. I like that concept of growing your database. I mean, every context with every athlete can be different, but when we zoom out and we see how things connect, I think that's where we can develop wisdom and turn experience into valuable knowledge to apply to other contexts and other experiences. So that was some reflection on the Don't Be a January Champion, and and again connecting to patience over the long term. So the topic today is the next Substack article, which is how I use progression as a training heuristic, and using that to create space in your training plan to hit optimal training doses in both the short and long term. So this connects to the previous ones of the common errors in championship performances, and the main theme being too much intensity too soon in training, and how this becomes unsustainable and can result ultimately in needing to then implement more rest and recovery than planned. And ultimately, when people talk about consistency in training, everyone agrees this is an important principle. However, where this comes apart and we lose consistency then is often as a result of when and how we implement intensity in the training plan. And the principle that's connected to this is, the right load at the right time. And it's very easy to get carried away with, where we see the search for confidence that results in pushing too hard at the wrong times, and this becomes self-sabotaging. And connected to this Don't Be a January Champion piece was the opportunity costs of doing too much high intensity or too much load at perhaps the wrong time to elicit peak performance when it really matters. And connected to that is the overestimation of the amount of intensity we need to have that peak performance. And it's something over time I've been dialing in probably less and less intensity or race-specific blocks, shorter and shorter intensity and race-specific blocks prior to major competitions, and seen that been very effective. So finding the minimal effective dose of training prior to competitions. So how does this all connect to the concept of progression? Well, this came up when I was discussing with a new athlete, and they remarked sort of the difference, what they had seen training with this methodology, this new methodology to them was typically they had, and this is very common. You train one intensity or zone during a training session. So, meaning if it's a quality session, you might be doing it all threshold intervals or all VO2 max intervals. So the intervals are the same intensity and type. Whereas what we are often doing, particularly in the beginning of the year, is we're doing sessions where there's a progression of the intensity step by step through the session. So it's multiple zones or stimulus across the session. So we're doing, the classic example is hill repeats where each rep is slightly higher and harder than the one before, and you progress. So why do you use these type of sessions? So there's a number of reasons. A big part of it is allowing the athlete to learn how to navigate and use their RPE on a given day so that they can manage their response to where they are in terms of overall chronic training load. So this is a very important skill that athletes can develop, and indeed at the highest levels of performance, athletes often are very good at dialing in their RPE to their performance on the day. So again, how that looks in practice, progressing as an example for hill repeats, for an athlete that maybe has an FTP of 300 watts, we might start a fair bit below that, go 250, 260, 70, 80, 90, 300, 310, 320. So we go under and over, and they can learn how to navigate this in different ways, and we provide a fair amount of autonomy to figure that out on the day. But it can be smaller steps and a lower peak output, or bigger steps and a higher, or a combination of thereof, and again, it allows the athlete to choose how to best manage the session to get themselves the best dose of training on the day, the best dose of intensity. And more isn't necessarily better. It's about getting the right level for where they are on the day. And it also it encourages good understanding of pacing and that sort of mind-body connection, RPE to physiology, which is a critical skill to develop for any athlete, but in particular at higher training loads where these can disconnect. Again, we often see, under fatigue, perhaps lower power speed versus higher RPE, and when there's that disconnection, we want to pay attention. So the other part of that is what does success look like in a session like that? Well, it's usually what I'm looking for is that there isn't a regression, that the athlete accurately predicts and manages step by step, so that each step is faster or higher watts or output than the one previously. So where this sometimes goes wrong is overestimating and then regressing. But those are teachable moments, and that's part of why we have this built into the programming. And it also creates space to progress and grow week by week. So the challenge that some people have with this is it has a certain amount of interpretation as opposed to precision. but that allows the day-to-day variance that we often see, and it creates more flexibility to get the right dose on the right day. The second part of how we do these is we're following the principle of extension. So meaning during a training block, as the weeks go by, the duration of the intervals gets longer each week, whereas the intensity within that duration remains similar week by week. So we're increasing the load by extension. So again, the athletes can learn how to navigate the outputs based on how they feel and the goals of progressing across the series and also week by week. So this day-to-day variation of performance, I think, is an important concept, particularly during more advanced training loads. There's going to be some days where it comes easier, some days where it's harder, and figuring out when to push, when to hold back, or when to stop a session are critical skills for athletes to learn. And one of my favorite quotes again is athletes can feel but can't see, coaches can see but can't feel, and it's connecting the two so the athlete can learn how to navigate that type of session. So that flexibility is really powerful. And I think, again, it's an advanced skill. Well, we often we want there to be, or there's a certain school that's very much about precision. I think in training, the reality of human performance is that there's a great deal of variability, and navigating that variability and learning when enough is enough, and or when there's an opportunity to push on are key skills that we want athletes to develop in order to get the most out of themselves. The second part of progression is really across a season. So first we're talking about within a session, but now a season. So again, with the January champion thoughts or principles, the question often we could ask ourselves is where do we go from here? And this question is often in my mind when I'm building training blocks. It's what are the appropriate steps? How do we progress the volume of intensity or work blocks across the weeks? How does the progression work from one week to the next? And again, the classic error that I might find myself making is progressing the volume of intensity too quick, meaning the steps week to week are too big. We're not reaching stability before moving on. And again, we see this all the time. Athletes who are doing relatively high loads very early in the training season and the build up. And again, the question is, if you're already doing a high load of, say, threshold work in January, then where are you going to go from there? And again, what we often see is that load becomes unsustainable, and the athlete is just sort of surviving the training rather than thriving. And again, that peak intensity load, it's so easy to overdo it. I think we want to have the feeling that, we could do one more rep, that we could do more, but we're holding back because we're trying to build the chronic load. So we don't want to hit that peak session load too early in the block, which then might cause us to need to build in rest that we hadn't planned, and then impact consistency, which then is going to impact that long-term chronic load. So it's very tempting to want to progress quickly. Sometimes the sessions feel too small, but again, within the wider context, the volume of intensity is not the only driver of the work. In fact, you would make the argument that it's that consistent chronic load that's the actual driver of aerobic development that's critical in endurance sport. And the intensity is only a small part of that, but the frequency and volume that accumulates week by week is the key driver. So all of this is about creating space to load step by step, and that concept of creating space, I think, is really valuable across a season. How we organize periodization, how do we allow ourselves to hold the load at one level before moving on, or even stopping the progression if we can see an athlete is reaching a ceiling that within a particular training block, and often, I mean, that can manifest itself by a little bit of regression, or we're no longer seeing uh, the medals, so to speak, within training plan. Medals meaning, the 90-day peak performances. We stop seeing those no, maybe sometimes can show a regression, and interpreting that could mean we need extra recovery, or we've reached the limit of what we can do in a particular block of, say, 4, 6, or 8 weeks. So hitting those session volumes too high too early, it's connected to that stress that athlete feels. It's the difference between adaptation and thriving, and just surviving, or we're completing the training, but the level of fatigue and stress is too high, and that's when we need to start really paying attention to what may happen next, whether it's often the context that niggles or injuries come up, and those are the things we want to avoid. And certainly many athletes, particularly with a periodization model that is not considering this big picture season narrative, get stuck in this survival mode. And then, we often see, okay, then something will happen, and they'll need to take more rest, and catching up in this way to finally absorb the work. It breaks that consistency, and it can take more time to get back on track, versus a wise and intelligent progression built into the programming for the first stage. So the third part of this wider concept of progression is progression over multi-year timing, and thinking about how long it can take to really grow training load tolerance. And of course, athletes want to perform well now. They want to have their performance demonstrated and their confidence improved in the short term. But again, the role of coaching, the role of guidance in the big picture is zooming out, thinking about how do we create a sensible progression over a multi-year model, so that we can avoid, again, the classic injury or burnouts that stop athletes from progressing and achieving their potential. So there's this model, the long-term athlete development model, LTAD, that has a nice framework for thinking about this. And it's about learning to train, training to train, training to win, etc., that type of model. And I think this training to train concept is really useful. Of course, it requires patience and perspective, and the principle that there are no shortcuts to long-term athlete performance. Again, the most common issues we see are athletes initially showing really high potential, and high, perhaps, trainability, but without a wise progression, multi-year progression, and particularly across season progression. We can see that potential stall out, and athletes seem to stop improving. And again, what I typically see is because that we're getting the training load too high for where the athlete is in their long-term development, and it becomes unsustainable, and will result in injury, illness, burnout, or other issues that will impact their ability to perform that long-term, consistent, chronic training load. and then we see the athletes just not able to progress or achieve what it appeared they would at the early stages. So it really requires this patience, progression over time, and it comes back to the very first point that it's key that athletes learn this self-management, so that they can account for the day-to-day variation, that they can hit the optimal training load. But then equally, the athletes and their team need to think long-term, big picture, leave space to grow, leave space to progress. Requires ego control, long-term perspective on the part of the athlete and coach. But it can certainly be a very powerful way, this concept of progression, to think long term and to answer the question of where do we go from here. And the final point was just this consistency trumps intensity. So again, everyone agrees consistency is important. It's the most probably common training principle that people talk about. But how you achieve consistency is really about this intensity management, and progression is a really useful tool that I've found to create that space so that we can build consistency over time. Again, so this started as a Substack article. If you're not subscribed to the Substack, go to subscribe now. And the next part we have here is some questions and answers. So I put on Instagram some questions and answers. I've got a backlog of these over time, but really interesting new ones that I'm going to think about today and answer today. And there's two about the evolution of relays, mixed team relays. So now we're into the third Olympic cycle of having a mixed team relay. The order is changed back again. I think it's a good development to change the order of female, male, or male, female starting and finishing. So the first question was the wisdom of federations. Example, Netherlands going all in on selection policy of mixed team relay. And I suppose that as a strategy, the background is in the Olympic selection. You can qualify teams or individuals. They're both sort of connected. The teams are prioritized in the Olympic criteria for LA, and the previous games were the same. But what is the wisdom of this? And well, I think the thought that comes to mind is I would dispute whether this is a wise policy to go all in on selection policy of the mixed team relay. And the reason for that is that we know empirically that basically the best athletes in the relay are the same as the best athletes in the standard distance race and the individual race. And there are really very few exceptions to this. And you can look at it by ranking, performance across weekends. There's different ways to look at it, and all of these analyses have been done before. And the relay is still relatively new, so this may evolve. But for the most part, it's difficult to pick out whether there's actually specialists in the relay. So in terms of going all in on selection policy for the relay, I think the principle of individual development is potentially what could be sacrificed. So in the long term, you want four or really a deeper pool of individual athletes who are progressing according to their individual profiles. And the better they get individually, the better they will be over a mixed relay. And there's also the theme that the mixed team relay, despite the name, is not a team event per se. It's for individual legs, and there's no interaction within the team. and there's a desire to, it's not a team pursuit on the track or otherwise. It's individual athletes racing in small fields that have their own dynamics, but ultimately, much like in Super League racing, it's basically the same athletes. There can be some different dynamics, and where there is an outlier, often what we have seen is that athlete may be underperforming in the individual events due to either their training age or other factors, rather than necessarily a specialist. So the wisdom of going all in selection, well, I would say as a long-term strategy, it's not the most wise strategy. And I think this, for the sustainability for the athletes, you want them to perform, and they need to perform as individuals as well. There's no such thing at the moment of athlete who's able to be a professional only as a relay athlete. They need to be able to survive and cope as individual professionals. And indeed, it's in the athlete's interest as well to have some independence from just mixed relay funding. So that's what I think about that. Short term versus long term, I wouldn't agree with that policy. Evolution of the mixed relay was the next question, and it's really connected to just what we're talking about. Relay specialists, yeah, I don't see that. Even the speeds we see in mixed relays are not really that different from the profiles, the speeds, the powers we see in sprint racing, or even in moments in standard distance racing. And I think that's just the consecutive nature of triathlon. Meaning that the bike and the run are essentially pre-fatigue states, and the swim is high contact, high impact between athletes. So it means the physiological demands end up very similar. And this may evolve; things could change, but that's what we've seen over the two cycles that we've had really serious relay competition. So that doesn't mean there aren't different profiles between the legs. We have seen scenarios where the different skill sets can make a big difference. We call them the difference maker type athletes. For example, athletes who may be able to close a gap from one leg to another. So, for example, if the athlete in the first leg, maybe this is not the best strategy, but maybe not the best runner, and then the second athlete has to dive in the water with a gap to make up to get back in a group, since that's really important, is to be able to do the bike in a group. Being a really fast swimmer in that scenario, which is different than the starting leg, which is a mass start, obviously. Every other leg ends up more spread out. So, being a very good swimmer, in particular, the type of speed when you're not swimming in a mass start can be a big difference maker. The other difference maker is the ability to close gaps on the bike, potentially alone. And these skills are highlighted in those scenarios, which often, of course, we do see in individual racing, but not to the same degree as sometimes we're seeing in some relays. So those are also connected to the tactics. It's very interesting to see the development of the relay orders. Again, this is not a new insight, despite what many teams do, but typically the best practice is to front load your team, because you need to stay in the race as long as possible. Front loading meaning you put your best athletes first, because if you're out of the race, you're out of the hunt for the top performances. So meaning if you put your weakest athlete first, you find the subsequent athletes really out of the race, perhaps riding alone or just not involved in the dynamics of the race. So That's still not always practiced. Everyone likes to think we're going to outsmart the tactics, but it's fairly straightforward. And again, with specific training, the demands are very similar. We've had a lot of athlete success in short super sprint distance, and we've done relatively little specific training for that because the demands are very similar across the different distances. Transitions, bike skills, closing gaps, finishing speed, starting speed. These are all important across all disciplines of short distance triathlon. And so we haven't necessarily needed to train specifically for the relay. And in fact, at the Olympic level, it's the same athletes that have to compete in both. So you must be prepared across the range. So those are the two kind of connections on relay. The next question was tips working with under 16 athletes, technique, skills, volume, speed, strength. Under 16, well, the first thing is that the environment is enjoyable, and that there's perhaps a group or social dynamic, or that the athlete is engaging and is having fun. There's an interesting quote from coach educator called Wayne Goldsmith from Australia, is that athletes don't quit sports, they quit coaches. And that resonated with me as a father of two kids in sport. And you can see if the athletes are not having fun, it starts to get a struggle to get them to go and participate, and they can't improve if they don't turn up. So first thing is what that environment is like, and whether they're having fun. There's a social element, and particularly with under 16s. I mean, we know triathlon is a late specialization sport. We want the athletes to persist long enough so they can see how good they are. They could become, and for under 16s, I mean, we need them to last another decade past that in order to achieve, get close to achieving their maximum potential. So with under 16s, you could argue, whether they should be in a triathlon program, or whether they should be doing, swim and run club or cycling clubs. I think it's not necessary to be in a triathlon focused program necessarily at that age. I think that connection with other sports, not even only swim, bike, run, but other sports as well, can be useful from athleticism, and building movement competency across the sport. But that said, for if we think long term, from what do we need under 16 athletes to be developing for future success, what are the foundations? Well, that movement competency, bike skills. Bike skills are hard to learn as athletes get older if they've not got a foundation in skills, bike handling, and particularly around as it relates to fear of descending, skills, speed. These are all more easily developed. Proximity as well to others, more easily developed when they're young. Well, it may not be the critical skill later for endurance performance. It's something that, if I'm working with a young athlete, one who has developed good technical skills, swimming stroke model, running speed skills, and bike skills, those are athletes that are going to have some foundation to progress. And I suppose the other one is, don't be afraid of frequency and volume. If there's the classic error with young athletes, it's doing way too much intensity versus compared to the total volume and frequency they're doing. Again, theme of the discussions and Substack articles we've shared so far. I've seen athletes who are running 3 times a week when they're young, and all of them are speed or hard sessions, which is not a good long-term strategy. So I think, again, don't be afraid of frequency and volume, and building the skills and foundation for endurance performance. It's more about, again, skills. I would differentiate when I'm saying speed skills for running. I'm not talking about hard track sessions, 1K repeats, etc., but biomechanical efficiency at speeds. Not threshold and that type of speed work. Yes, again, a lot of athletes, what stops them progressing is that they've done too much too soon and they have nowhere to go. Again, connecting to this progression theme of today's podcast. So what would I wish for them? That they arrive, into their 20s without having had long-term injury issues. Again, you see so many athletes that arrive, they've had bone stress, they've had other issues, and then as a result, usually they've lost some of the chronic load that they could be gradually building up. So again, summary with U16 athletes: keep it fun, keep them connected to the other sports, allow them time and space to eventually specialize, but they don't need to specialize at U16. And again, there was an article on long-term talent development recently that came out, which again distinguished athletes who perform very well when they're younger are not necessarily the same athletes that achieve the top performances as adults. And it's very hard to manage this in the context that, of course, athletes, parents, coaches, programs want to see athletes' success. They like to see it early. They get on board and they start piling on attention and resources to young athletes who demonstrate talent early. But in fact, we need to leave space for athletes to develop over the long term. And many athletes who perform very well when they're very young fail to progress over the long term for all different reasons. But we need to think again. We need athletes to persist in the sport, for another decade past this to see how good they can be. So that's U16 and some quick thoughts on development. The next question was how to get through a plateau, so a performance plateau. So plateaus, when we're not seeing performance improvement in competitions. Of course, we also see that in training, but we often would think about a performance plateau, meaning athletes are investing and progressing the training, not seeing that reflected in competition performance, or even a regression. And of course, it's one of those questions where the default answer is, well, it depends what's led to that. But I would say a significant commonality that I see is really connected to the last few episodes, going from understanding championship performances to this January champion principle to this concept of progression, and that's that the periodization isn't aligned to when we want to see our best performances, and the periodization isn't connected to the investment required to change performance. So the most extreme examples I see are athletes who have very little change in the type of training they do through the course of a year or season. They may enter a specific phase of training very early in their training plan, and they try to maintain that through the season. I see often, high intensity race specific, track sessions, hard bikes, all through, for extended periods of time, and never really building the the space to build up that chronic load and build up the low intensity work that is the platform where you eventually see breaking through that plateau can then be reached. So I look at the periodization first. Again, I feel like a broken record in some respects, but too much intensity at the wrong times is also a common factor in athletes not getting or being at a performance plateau or not being able to break through and improve their performance, not creating space within the season in terms of periodization to retrain or rebuild our endurance foundations. So again, it comes back to long-term thinking, building the chronic load and having the right doses of intensity. One factor I see more recently is the density of competitions that we might plan. So too many competitions in a short period of time, in particular before what we might say are the more important competitions, that makes it hard to perform at a higher level because through a phase of multi-competitions, essentially our form is going down because I think in endurance sport, the stimulus to improve, we can't get that stimulus just from competitions. It's coming from training. In fact, most of the time that competition stimulus is a lower load than a training load. So we need those periods of patiently progressing in order to create space to get through a performance plateau. That said, often in athletes' development, plateaus are common, and it's can also be a stabilization of performance before we have eventually an improvement. So it doesn't necessarily require an intervention. It depends on the context. But yeah, the previous reasons are why I would often see that. And the final question in this series today is also really the same theme, which is I mentioned that a lot of people overestimate the amount of high intensity they need to do. And I suppose, what is the right amount? Well, it's a question that's difficult to answer precisely, but we have some guidelines that we can use. So again, I like this concept, and I'll expand in a future episode about minimal effective dose of intensity, not total workload, but the right amount of intensity. So as I said earlier, I shortened the amount of blocks that I've done of race-specific work. I think the interesting balance between sort of the base and foundation or strength endurance work and race-specific work. I think for some athletes, you could go as short as 4 to 6 weeks of race-specific work, and I would suggest experimenting with shorter periods of time when we're into that race-specific type intensity. And that of course varies depending what format we're talking about. If we're talking about full distance Ironman competition, well, that's going to look a little differently to middle distance 70.3 T100, which is going to look a little differently to short distance. But again, the principle can still apply in the same way of how much race-specific sessions that we're doing. Even in full distance, very, very demanding to do a full distance bike at race pace or with a high volume of race pace or long runs at pace. Of course, we want to develop those abilities, but we don't need to be doing those 12 months of the year either. So I think experimenting with shorter amounts of race-specific blocks, and then going deeper into that question is within a cycle or a block of work, what is that? What is the right amount? And for a lot of top athletes, 2 quality sessions in each sport per week is common. but that may be too much intensity for those that have other constraints, work, life, families, and certainly I play with the dose of intensity within that. It could be one session or just smaller doses of intensity within that. So again, it's a question that has multiple layers, but the heuristic that the right dose of intensity at the right time and doing less than you think is a good one that I think about and that I'm always trying to implement in my coaching and training. So good questions. Some really inside baseball stuff with the relays, and then some more general with athlete development, plateaus, and intensity doses that nicely tie up this progression concept. So in closing, if you're not subscribed to the Substack, I'm starting the podcast in long form writing and then expanding out into these podcasts. It's available on YouTube as well. Coaching is available. It's a way to support sharing these kind of perspectives and this work. So that can be a one-to-one coaching for athletes. It can be consulting, looking through programs, trying to unpick how you may have reached a plateau or other problems, what the right amount of intensity can be for an individual context. Or coaching for coaches. I think having a second set of eyes on your coaching is super valuable, and it's something I've really enjoyed doing with a number of coaches worldwide. If you found any of this useful, share it with a friend, thinking that value for value model, somebody that might benefit from this perspective. And thanks for listening.